So today in this session we are going to revise lipids, right? In this session we are going to revise lipids. Now lipids, these are the example of biomicromolecules, right? Lipids, amino acid, right? Lipid, amino acid, these all are example of biomicromolecule. Sugars, these are also examples of biomicromolecule. Nitrogen bases, these are also example of biomicromolecules. अब बायोमाइक्रोमोलिक्यूल्स क्या होता है? आपने पढ़ा होगा कि एनसीईआरटी का जो फर्स्ट पैराग्राफ है उसमें हम क्या करते थे कि कैसे एक टिश्यू में, है ना, केमिकल कॉम्पोजिशन का हम एनालिसिस करते थे. उसमें क्या करते थे, हम एक लिविंग टिश्यू लेते थे. फॉर एग्जांपल लेट्स से वेजिटेबल्स और वहाँ पे हम लीवर का एक छोटा सा टुकड़ा लेते थे. उसको क्या करते थे, ग्राइंड करते थे, है ना, इसको ग्राइंड करते थे, पीसते थे एक एसिड में. आपको एसिड का नाम याद होगा, ट्राइक्लोरो एसिटिक एसिड, राइट? ट्राइक्लोरो, that is Cl3, and acetic acid, that is COOH. So this is trichloro acetic acid. इसमें पीसते थे और उसके बाद क्या करते थे, है ना, हमें एक सेमी लिक्विड मिक्सचर मिलता था. फिर उसको हम चीज़ क्लोथ या फिर आप कॉटन ले लीजिए, उससे उसको स्ट्रेन करते थे. तो हमें दो पार्ट मिलता था उसका, है ना, दो पार्ट मिलता था. एक तो जो एसिड हमने यूज़ किया था उसमें जो मिक्स हुआ, है ना, जो हमें फिल्ट्रेट मिला, मतलब ऐसा इस ऑर्गेनिक सब्सटेंस का ऐसा पार्ट जो उस एसिड में मिक्स हो गया, घुल गया, सोल्यूबल है, उसको बोलते थे फिल्ट्रेट, राइट? और जो नहीं घुला उसमें उसको बोलते थे रिटेंटेड. And this filtrate, in which the part of organic like vegetables or liver, right, living tissue, the part of living tissue which was evenly mixed in the acid was called as filtrate, right? And which was not mixed in the acid was called as retentate. So filtrate was actually the acid soluble pool and retentate was acid insoluble pool, right? and जो फिल्ट्रेट होता था जिसमें एसिड सॉल्युबल पूल है, इसमें आता था बायोमाइक्रोमोलिक्यूल, राइट? और जो एसिड इनसॉल्युबल पूल है इसमें आता था बायो मैक्रोमोलिक्यूल्स. यस और नो? अब बायो माइक्रोमोलिक्यूल्स जो है, जो फिल्ट्रेट में आ रहा था, तो अगर इसकी मॉलिक्यूलर वेट की बात करें तो इसका मॉलिक्यूलर वेट होता था, दैट वाज लेस देन 1000 डाल्टन, लेस देन 1000 डाल्टन. एंड बायो मैक्रोमोलिक्यूल का जो मॉलिक्यूलर वेट होता था दैट वाज ग्रेटर देन 1000 डाल्टन. यस और नो? अब बायो माइक्रोमोलिक्यूल का जो एग्जाम्पल था दैट वाज अमीनो एसिड, सुगर्स, नाइट्रोजन बेस एंड लिपिड्स. तो इस सेशन में हम लिपिड्स के बारे में पढ़ेंगे, राइट? नाउ सी, लिपिड्स जो हैं these are water insoluble, अब लिपिड्स में क्या प्रेजेंट होगा? ऑफ कोर्स लिपिड्स में कार्बन होगा, हाइड्रोजन होगा, ऑक्सीजन होगा. लेकिन जो ऑक्सीजन का नंबर है वो कम होगा. सो ऑक्सीजन एटम will be less in number, right? Oxygen atom will be less in number. अब हम क्या पढ़ेंगे? क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ लिपिड्स, राइट? क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ लिपिड्स पढ़ेंगे. सो लिपिड्स जो है, लिपिड्स को हम 3 टाइप्स में डिवाइड करते हैं. 3 टाइप्स में we divide lipids in 3 types. First one is the simple lipid. Simple lipids. One is the simple lipid. Second type of lipid is compound lipid. Compound lipids. And third type is derived lipid. Derived lipids. Now look, सिंपल लिपिड. सबसे पहली बात तो लिपिड है ना, बनेगा कैसे, इसके बारे में बात करते हैं. सिंपल लिपिड्स कैसे बनेगा ये बात करते हैं. सिंपल लिपिड बनता है, हम क्या करते हैं, फैटी एसिड लेते हैं, राइट? एंड फैटी एसिड का हम रिएक्शन करवाते हैं अल्कोहल से. अल्कोहल से. अब फैटी एसिड और अल्कोहल क्या होता है आप ये समझो. अल्कोहल में जैसे हम ग्लिसरॉल ले लेते हैं, है ना. अभी सब हम ना सबका स्ट्रक्चर अपन डिस्कस करेंगे. फैटी एसिड क्या होता है? फैटी एसिड एक्चुअली दीज आर ऑर्गेनिक एसिड. ऑर्गेनिक एसिड्स. फैटी एसिड्स आर ऑर्गेनिक एसिड. इफ वी लुक द structure of fatty acid, so in structure we'll find an alkyl group which is represented by R, right? This can also be called as hydrocarbon chain, right? R group. And with R group we will have COOH, carboxylic group attached to hydrocarbon chain. Then these compounds will be called as organic acid, which are actually the fatty acid, right? For example, if we talk about some fatty acid, examples can be written as palmitic acid. Palmitic acid. So the structure of palmitic acid is CS3, CS2, whole 14, COH. See, this part is the hydrocarbon chain which can be represented as R, and with hydrocarbon chain COOH group is attached. So this becomes fatty acid, or we can say this is organic acid, right? And the example is palmitic acid. Now if you look very closely and if you count the number of carbon atom in palmitic acid, so 14 carbon is here, one is 15 and one is 16. So palmitic acid has 16 carbon in it. Very important. This question is actually asked in examination, right? So this is palmitic acid. Again, one very important example is arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid. The structure of arachidonic acid is actually this acid has 20 carbon in it. 20 carbon in it, right? So these two acid, which is actually fatty acid, you'll have to remember palmitic acid has 16 carbon in it and arachidonic acid has 20 carbon in it, right? Now we discussed about a fatty acid, its structure and some example, right? Now this fatty acid can be of two types. Now see, whenever we divide something, so we divide something on basis of something, राइट। जैसे अपन फैटी एसिड के दो टाइप्स, अभी मैंने बोला कि फैटी एसिड के दो टाइप्स होते हैं। तो जब भी हम किसी चीज़ को डिवाइड करते हैं तो किसी के बेसिस पे करते हैं। यहाँ पे क्या बेसिस है कि फैटी एसिड में मैंने आपको बोला था कि एक हाइड्रोकार्बन चेन होगा। अब जबकि हाइड्रोकार्बन चेन है तो हाइड्रोकार्बन चेन can have double bond, can have single bond. So if the complete hydrocarbon chain will have single bond, then we will call that fatty acid as saturated fatty acid. So simple. Saturated fatty acid. So if someone will ask you what is saturated fatty acid, then you'll answer him that saturated fatty acid is that type of fatty acid in which the hydrocarbon chain will have only single bond. There will be no double or triple bond. Yes or no? An example is very important. So example of saturated fatty acid is, we talked about palmitic acid, right? Palmitic acid has 16 carbon. So palmitic acid will be its example. Palmitic acid has 16 carbon, very important. Another example is stearic acid. Stearic acid is also a type of saturated fatty acid. Again, let me revise you. Let me give you a revision. Saturated fatty acid is that type of fatty acid in which the hydrocarbon chain will have only single bond. There will be no double or triple bond. Now, the second type is, now you can tell by yourself also that hydrocarbon chain here will have double or triple bond. So we can say second type of fatty acid can be unsaturated fatty acid. Unsaturated fatty acid. An example of unsaturated fatty acid will be, first example, oleic acid. Second example will be arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid. And we talked earlier that arachidonic acid will have 20 carbon in it. If you want to write a structure also, we can write a structure also. The formula for arachidonic acid is C19S31 COOH. Now count the number of carbon. Here is 19 carbon and 1 carbon will be added from acid. So in total 20 carbons are present in arachidonic acid. So this was the discussion on simple acid. Simple acid is made up of fatty acid plus alcohol such as glycerol. We talked about fatty acid. Fatty acid is also organic acid. Example is palmitic acid, arachidonic acid. Palmitic acid has 16 carbon in it. Arachidonic acid has 20 carbon in it. Now fatty acid can be divided into two types based on the number of bonds between carbon in the hydrocarbon chain of that fatty acid. It can be saturated fatty acid and unsaturated fatty acid. Now we will talk about the structure of glycerol, because simple lipid will be formed from fatty acid plus glycerol. So we discussed about fatty acid. Now we will discuss about glycerol. So let's discuss about glycerol. So glycerol. So glycerol is also called as trihydroxypropane. Trihydroxypropane. Now why it is called as trihydroxypropane? Let me write the structure and then you'll understand why it is called as trihydroxypropane. The structure of glycerol can be written as CH2OH, CHOH and CH2OH. See, in this structure you can clearly see there are 3 OH group, right? 3 OH group. That's why we say trihydroxy. And 3 carbon atom. 1 carbon atom we say meth, 2 carbon atom eth, 3 carbon atom we say propane. 3 carbon atom, that's why propane. 3 OH group, that's why we say trihydroxy. So glycerol is trihydroxypropane. Yes or no? Now, this was the structure of glycerol. We talked about fatty acid. So now fatty acid will react with glycerol, and you know that whenever an organic acid reacts with alcohol, it gives ester plus water, and this reaction is called as esterification. If you don't know, let me write it for you. So we have used a term that is esterification. What is esterification? Esterification is when we react organic acid with alcohol, we get ester plus water, and this reaction is called as esterification. And this ester will have ester bond, right? So fatty acid we discussed earlier. Now we are reacting fatty acid with glycerol. So what will happen? There can be monoglyceride, there can be monoglyceride, there can be diglyceride, and there can be triglyceride. Triglycerides can be formed when we react fatty acid with glycerol. Now you can ask question that when monoglyceride will be formed, when diglyceride will be formed, and when triglyceride will be formed. See, if you react one glycerol, if you take one glycerol and one fatty acid, if you take one glycerol and one fatty acid, you'll get monoglyceride, right? Now if you take one glycerol and if you take two fatty acid, you'll get diglyceride, right? If you take one glycerol and if you take 3 fatty acid, you'll get triglyceride. So simple, right? So this was the discussion of glycerol, and we discussed about the reaction between fatty acid plus glycerol. We can get monoglyceride, we can get diglyceride, and we can get triglyceride. Now one discussion we can do on triglyceride, one thing we can discuss on triglyceride is that ट्राइग्लिसराइड, सबसे पहले तो आप मुझे ये बताइए कि ट्राइग्लिसराइड बनेगा कैसे। आप जब एक ग्लिसरॉल और 3 फैटी एसिड का रिएक्शन करवाएंगे तो ऑफकोर्स ऑर्गेनिक एसिड का रिएक्शन करवा रहे हैं अल्कोहल के साथ, तो दिस रिएक्शन विल बी कॉल्ड एज एस्टेरिफिकेशन और ट्राइग्लिसराइड बनेगा। अब ट्राइग्लिसराइड जो है इसको हम 2 टाइप्स में डिवाइड करते हैं, अगेन मैं वापस से बोल रहा हूँ कि जब भी अपन किसी चीज़ का डिवीज़न करते हैं तो किसी के बेसिस पे करते हैं। तो यहाँ जो बेसिस है वो है मेल्टिंग पॉइंट। अब देखिए, ट्राइग्लिसराइड कैन बी डिवाइडेड इनटू 2 टाइप्स, वन इज फैट्स एंड वन इज ऑयल, राइट? फैट्स हैव हाई मेल्टिंग पॉइंट and oil has low melting point. And NCERT says example of oil is gingerly oil, right? So triglyceride can be fat, can be oil. Why fat? Because it has high melting point. Why oil? Because it has low melting point, right? So this was the complete discussion of simple lipid. Let me give you a quick revision. Simple lipid was formed of fatty acid and glycerol. Glycerol is an alcohol. Now fatty acid, what was fatty acid? Fatty acid was a hydrocarbon chain attached with COH group, right? The example can be palmitic acid, which has 16 carbon, arachidonic acid, which has 20 carbon. We talked about fatty acid can be of two types, saturated and unsaturated fatty acid, based on whether the carbon has single bond or double or triple bond. Saturated fatty acid will have single bond. Example can be palmitic acid and stearic acid. And unsaturated fatty acid, in which the hydrocarbon chain will have double or triple bond. Example can be oleic acid and arachidonic acid. Then we talked about structure of glycerol, and we talked about glycerol can be called as trihydroxypropane. Why? Because it was having 3 OS bond with 3 carbon atom. So that's why it was called as trihydroxypropane, right? And then we reacted fatty acid with glycerol, and whenever we react an organic acid with alcohol, we call this reaction as esterification reaction, in which esters are formed, and along with esters water will be formed. An ester, of course, ester will have ester bond. And if we take one glycerol, one fatty acid, we'll get monoglycerides. If we take one glycerol, 2 fatty acid, we'll get diglyceride. And if we take one glycerol, 3 fatty acid, we'll get triglyceride. And again we divided triglyceride into 2 types based on the melting point. If the melting point is high, we called it as fat, and if the melting point was low, we called it as oil. And the example of oil can be gingerly oil. So this was the discussion of simple lipid. And if you remember, we divided lipid into simple lipid, compound lipid, derived lipid. Now it's time to learn compound lipid. So we'll discuss it here only. See, लिपिड अगर हमने बोला है तो पक्का कहीं ना कहीं उसमें फैटी एसिड और ग्लिसरॉल तो होगा ही होगा, फैटी एसिड अल्कोहल होगा ही होगा. अगर फैटी एसिड और अल्कोहल के अलावा कोई एक एडिशनल ग्रुप उसमें जुड़ जाए, सो व्हाट वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट इज दैट इसमें फैटी एसिड और साथ में ग्लिसरॉल तो होगा ही होगा, साथ में इसमें कुछ एडिशनल ग्रुप प्रेजेंट होंगे. और अगर ऐसा है देन वी कॉल दीज लिपिड्स एज कंपाउंड लिपिड. जैसे मैं आपको एग्जाम्पल दे के बताता हूँ, देन यू विल अंडरस्टैंड इट मोर क्लियरली. एग्जाम्पल कैन बी फॉस्फोलिपिड, right? Phospholipid, let me give you a quick revision that phospholipid we talked about in cell, the structure and functional unit of light, when we read about cell membrane. So we talked about in cell membrane we have lecithin. So lecithin is basically the phospholipid. So phospholipid example can be lecithin. See, हम ये बोल रहे हैं कि phospholipid is the example of compound lipid, and just now we talked about that compound lipid will be formed of fatty acid, glycerol plus additional group. So in phospholipid, fatty acid will be there, glycerol will be there, and the additional group in phospholipid will be what? Phosphate, right? Example will be lecithin. Structure of lecithin is also important because that structure is given in NCERT, and anything in NCERT becomes very important as per NEET examination, right? Now we will talk about, so this was the discussion of compound lipid, that's it, right? This was very simple. Now we will talk about derived lipid. How we get derived lipid, that is very important. What we do is that we take